Silence did not last long. Within minutes after the first fragmented reports, it became clear something irreversible had occurred. According to official statements, a section of the so-called land corridor connecting southern Russia with occupied Crimea had been temporarily disabled. But the tone of that phrasing immediately raised doubts among analysts. In fact, the corridor, the critical overland supply route through the occupied territories, was not disabled. It was destroyed. By the middle of the day, multiple military monitoring channels confirmed what many had feared: the main transport arteries leading from the Russian mainland toward the Crimean peninsula were no longer operational. Satellite images showed gaping breaks in the road infrastructure near the key junctions of Melitopol and Henichesk, areas that for months had served as lifelines for Russian logistics. Officially, Moscow called it a technical incident. Unofficially, insiders described it as a collapse, both literal and symbolic. According to information obtained throughout the day, explosions were recorded in several sections almost simultaneously, suggesting a coordinated operation rather than an isolated strike. The Russian Ministry of Defense avoided direct acknowledgement, issuing instead a brief statement about temporary relocation of supply routes. However, in expert circles, such language was immediately interpreted as an attempt to avoid admitting a large-scale strategic defeat. The so-called land bridge had been central to Russia's control over Crimea, and its sudden disruption meant far more than just logistical difficulty. In Kiev, the news was received cautiously. There were no official celebrations, no public declarations. The silence was deliberate, a signal that what happened was part of a larger plan still unfolding. Meanwhile, international analysts began to describe the event as a tectonic shift in the operational map of the region. The symbolic value of the corridor had always exceeded its practical function. It represented the illusion of permanence. And now that illusion had collapsed. By this point, Russian state media struggled to maintain coherence in their messaging. Some outlets spoke of unprecedented weather conditions, others, of terrorist sabotage. But as the day went on, even loyal commentators could no longer avoid the visible, long columns of vehicles heading north, away from Crimea. Eyewitness footage, circulating despite heavy censorship, showed military convoys mixed with civilian cars, all moving in one direction. Out. In the expert community, this mass withdrawal is already being compared to the early days of chaotic retreats that once preceded major turning points in other conflicts. Yet, what distinguishes this situation is not panic, but quiet inevitability. As one analyst noted in a private briefing, when a corridor built on occupation collapses, the exit always begins before the announcement. Between the cautious official silence and the growing digital noise, a single pattern emerged. The land link, long touted as Moscow's irreversible victory, had become its weakest point. And in that weakness, the broader system began to tremble. But what followed was even more revealing. According to our sources, Russian forces stationed deep inside Crimea were instructed to prepare for logistical adjustments, a phrase that, in military language, often precedes evacuation. Meanwhile, local administrations were ordered to limit public communication. The result was predictable: silence filled the space where authority once was. And in that silence, the scale of the loss became impossible to hide. At first glance, the day appeared calm. But only at first. The corridors were gone, the exits were filling, and somewhere in the background, a different kind of movement began, not of troops, but of uncertainty. The kind that spreads faster than any convoy. Some insiders already describe the situation as the beginning of a reversal. And though no official statement confirms it, the direction of the movement speaks for itself. Perhaps, it is worth paying close attention to what happens next. As many analysts quietly suggest, this is only the beginning of a much larger retreat, one that may soon reshape the map altogether. By this moment, the situation around the collapsed land corridor had turned from confusion into a strategic crisis. Official statements in Moscow grew shorter, colder, and less coherent. The word temporary disappeared from briefings, replaced with vague references to alternative logistics. But those alternatives no longer existed. The land bridge through southern Ukraine, stretching across Mariupol, Melitopol, and Henichesk, was the only stable supply artery connecting Russian forces to Crimea. Its destruction isolated the peninsula completely. Throughout the day, data from monitoring groups confirmed what Russian authorities avoided mentioning. Rail movement across occupied territories had halted. Convoys that once carried fuel and ammunition were now immobilized, their routes cut off by cratered roads and targeted strikes. Several communication nodes were reported offline, leaving units in northern Crimea disconnected from command centers. In analytical terms, the corridor was not merely damaged, it had ceased to exist as an operational structure. In expert circles, the consequences of this development were described as structural disconnection. The land bridge had been the foundation of Russia's post-2022 strategy. It provided the illusion of control, the sense that Crimea could be held indefinitely. Without it, every calculation changed. According to insiders, military planners in Moscow are now forced to rely on the unstable maritime route across the Kerch Strait, a corridor already under constant surveillance and threat. It's not a question of if, but when, remarked one European defense official. Meanwhile, within Crimea itself, the atmosphere shifted visibly. According to information obtained by regional observers, several administrative offices quietly relocated their operations northward, toward the peninsula's exit zones. Local employees reportedly received orders to prepare essential documentation for emergency transfer. In public, officials continued to insist that transportation remained stable. In private, sources spoke of confusion, exhaustion, and fear. By this point, the physical collapse of the corridor had begun to manifest politically. Russian state channels avoided showing maps of the region, while independent outlets inside the country experienced sudden, technical maintenance. For a system built on total control of the narrative, this silence was telling. When the map disappears from the broadcast, one political analyst noted, it usually means the territory is already gone. At the same time, across international defense networks, satellite feeds revealed large-scale movements along the northern approaches to Crimea. Columns of military trucks were observed retreating in disorganized patterns, not under attack, but without coordination. Analysts interpret this as the clearest sign that command structures are fragmenting. Without a secure route, evacuation becomes improvisation. In Kiev, analysts remained cautious in tone but firm in assessment. The logistics collapse was only a matter of time, one source commented. What we're witnessing now is not a single strike, it's the slow implosion of an occupation model built on denial. By this hour, the Russian Defense Ministry continued to deny reports of withdrawal. Yet satellite imagery contradicted every word. In several sectors, newly built field camps were already being dismantled. Trucks left behind ammunition depots, vehicles abandoned in trenches, positions vacated without orders. To those observing the data streams, it appeared less like a tactical regrouping and more like an unplanned evacuation. And yet, the most striking development was not the visible retreat, but the sudden appearance of silence, official, deliberate, unbroken. No press briefings. No statements. No denials. For a government obsessed with message control, this silence was an admission. Something fundamental had shifted. In diplomatic circles, the tone also changed. European and American representatives avoided public celebration, emphasizing the need for restraint. But behind closed doors, the assessment was unanimous: Russia's strategic posture in the south had collapsed. Crimea, long presented as untouchable, now stood exposed. At first glance, Moscow continued to project confidence, televised meetings, calm ministers, formal speeches. But beneath that surface, the system was clearly recalibrating, searching for a narrative that could survive the loss. And still, the images of retreating convoys kept spreading online, faster than any censorship could suppress them. By now, it was no longer a question of territory, it was a question of perception. And in that battle, Moscow was already losing. Yet for those observing closely, one detail stood out. The withdrawal from Crimea did not begin with an order. It began with an understanding that the bridge was gone, and with it, the illusion of return. By this point, the situation had moved beyond the loss of a corridor. It had become an unraveling of control, a process both visible and silent. According to information obtained throughout the day, Russian command structures in Crimea were functioning in isolation, their communication links to the mainland heavily disrupted. Attempts to reroute logistics through maritime convoys across the Kerch Strait reportedly failed under the strain of overloaded capacity and continuing drone surveillance. For the first time since the occupation began, Crimea was operating as an enclave, cut off, uncertain, and surrounded by silence. In expert circles, the tone shifted from analytical caution to quiet certainty. This is not a tactical setback, one senior military observer noted, this is systemic collapse. The loss of the land bridge dismantled more than a supply chain, it dissolved the psychological foundation of permanence. For years, Moscow portrayed Crimea as irreversibly integrated, a fact of history. Now, that narrative had fractured. Every image of retreating vehicles, every silent evacuation convoy, became a visual confession: the irreversible could be reversed. According to sources close to local administrations, panic among civilian collaborators began to spread by midday. Evacuation lists circulated through encrypted channels, selected personnel were offered temporary relocation to southern Russia. Those unable to leave immediately were advised to remain discreet and mobile. The wording alone revealed the depth of fear. Meanwhile, in several towns across northern Crimea, checkpoints began redirecting traffic toward the peninsula's interior, not for control, but to prevent congestion of outbound routes. The movement of people was no longer coordinated. It was instinctive. Between these moments of administrative breakdown, a different form of chaos emerged: informational. Russian media outlets received direct instructions to avoid mentioning the words Crimea and corridor in the same sentence. State television shifted focus to foreign affairs, while official channels filled airtime with cultural programming. But in digital spaces, where control faltered, the truth circulated freely. Images of convoys at choke points, abandoned depots, and darkened fuel stations painted a portrait of quiet disintegration. By this time, international monitoring agencies confirmed that Russian command nodes on the peninsula had entered what they described as containment mode. That meant conserving remaining resources, minimizing movement, and avoiding open engagement. In strategic terms, it was the posture of a force preparing to leave without announcing it. Analysts compared it to the pattern seen in previous withdrawals, a slow fading rather than a sudden flight. But unlike past retreats, this one unfolded under the shadow of political silence. No orders. No acknowledgement. Only absence. In diplomatic briefings, the event was already being called the point of no return. Western officials avoided public statements, but private correspondence obtained by our newsroom indicates consensus: the loss of the land bridge marks the beginning of Crimea's isolation, and eventually, its return to a state of uncertainty. The symbolic weight of that change extends far beyond the battlefield. For Russia, the corridor represented a line of legitimacy; for the world, its destruction signals the unraveling of a myth. At the same time, in Moscow, officials appeared increasingly constrained. Meetings of the Security Council continued behind closed doors, with no transcripts released. Rumors of internal disagreements surfaced, particularly between the military command and regional governors responsible for logistics. The problem, one insider said quietly, is not that the bridge is gone. It's that no one knows how to explain it. Inside Crimea, reports of electricity outages and communication blackouts multiplied. Fuel reserves were running low. Civilians lined up near ports, seeking any means of exit. Yet, outwardly, the official tone remained unchanged: the situation is stable. But in the expert community, that phrase has long been decoded. It is used when the situation is anything but. Observers noted a striking shift in the behavior of Russian forces. Units that had once enforced order now focused solely on self-protection. Checkpoints were abandoned, fortifications left incomplete. The peninsula, once saturated with symbols of control, was dissolving into fragments. It was no longer an occupied territory, it was a retreating memory. At first glance, the silence might have seemed like composure. But for those watching closely, it was the silence of realization, the moment when an empire understands that it cannot hold what it cannot reach. And yet, as some insiders cautiously noted, what was collapsing in Crimea was not just a corridor or a front line. It was the logic of the entire war, the belief that geography could still be controlled by force. From this point onward, the question was no longer how Russia would defend Crimea. It was whether it could afford to stay at all. By this point, the rhythm of the day had changed completely. The earlier confusion, marked by fragmented reports and cautious statements, had given way to something colder: a structured silence. According to multiple analytical sources, Russian forces in Crimea had entered what internal documents described as Stage 3 of logistical transition, a phrase that, in military language, usually refers to the controlled dismantling of operational positions. Yet, nothing about what was happening appeared controlled. Throughout the day, signs of disintegration multiplied. Traffic data revealed continuous movement northward across the peninsula. Civilian vehicles mixed with military convoys, each seeking an exit that no longer existed. The Kerch ferry, the last official escape route to the Russian mainland, was overwhelmed. At ports in Kerch and Feodosia, eyewitnesses reported columns of trucks waiting for hours without coordination, engines idling in long lines that stretched toward the coastline. "There is no command, no direction," one local observer told our sources. "Just movement," as if everyone realized, at the same time, that they have to get out. By this hour, several key logistical hubs had ceased functioning altogether. The Dzankoy railway junction, once the lifeline between northern Crimea and the mainland, was reported offline. Fuel depots in the area, already hit by previous strikes, stood empty. The airfields at Sakei and Hvardiisk, which had served as staging points for Russian aircraft, reduced activity to minimal levels. Technicians were observed dismantling equipment rather than repairing it. Each movement suggested the same conclusion: the infrastructure of occupation was being quietly decommissioned. According to intelligence assessments, the destruction of the land corridor did more than isolate Crimea, it exposed the fragility of Russia's logistical ecosystem. For years, the Kremlin had built its narrative of permanence on the ability to move, supply, and project control. Now, that foundation was gone. When supply lines die, political narratives die with them, remarked one senior European analyst. You can't occupy territory you can't reach. Meanwhile, inside Russia, state media continued to operate in parallel reality. The evening broadcasts made no mention of the corridor, focusing instead on cultural festivals, economic achievements, and space programs. Yet, as one insider from a major Russian channel admitted privately, we were instructed not to mention Crimea at all unless quoting the ministry. It's as if the peninsula stopped existing in the news cycle. For a system that measures power through visibility, that invisibility was devastating. In the diplomatic sphere, quiet coordination began to take shape. According to our sources in Brussels, NATO command centers had shifted to monitoring mode, tracking not just military movements, but the emerging humanitarian flow from Crimea. Early estimates indicated thousands of civilians attempting to leave through unofficial routes. Many of them were individuals who had collaborated with occupation authorities and feared reprisals. Their departure marked a psychological turning point, the unraveling of local loyalty networks that had sustained Russia's presence for over a decade. Inside the peninsula, power structures began to fracture. Reports surfaced of regional administrators deleting records, removing insignia, and issuing exit passes under different names. In several municipalities, Russian flags were quietly taken down from administrative buildings, replaced with neutral symbols, not Ukrainian, not Russian, just blank banners of avoidance. For analysts observing these developments, it was the clearest signal yet: the occupation was entering its terminal phase. According to information obtained from defense insiders, Moscow's Central Command had already drafted contingency plans titled Phase Red South. The language of the document, described by one source as pre-evacuation protocol, outlined the transfer of personnel and equipment via maritime routes under civilian cover. However, with the Kerch crossing congested and vulnerable, implementing that plan became almost impossible. The peninsula, one observer noted, has turned from an asset into a liability. Internationally, reactions remained measured but significant. Diplomatic communiques from Washington, London, and Berlin avoided triumphalism, yet the underlying tone was unmistakable: the event had shifted the strategic balance of the entire region. If Crimea can be cut off, said one defense expert, then the entire architecture of Russian expansion is no longer sustainable. The phrase circulated quietly in professional circles: the corridor collapsed, but with it collapsed the illusion of control. By now, the psychological impact inside Moscow was becoming visible even through the filters of censorship. Financial markets showed sudden volatility, defense-linked enterprises experienced rapid sell-offs. Analysts in private channels described the mood within the political establishment as restrained panic, the understanding that something foundational had broken, though no one dared name it. The silence of leadership, once a tool of control, had turned into evidence of paralysis. In Crimea itself, the atmosphere was surreal. The sound of traffic mixed with an uncanny stillness: streets half-empty, shopfronts closed, communication networks unstable. Military checkpoints that once symbolized authority now stood deserted. Power outages rolled through several regions, and satellite imagery confirmed the dimming of entire districts. "It feels like a blackout of history," said one observer. "As if the place is preparing to vanish." And yet, despite the chaos, the retreat unfolded with strange calm. No formal surrender, no negotiations, only withdrawal disguised as maintenance. For the first time in over a decade, the peninsula seemed to exist outside of Moscow's grasp, suspended between occupation and abandonment. Analysts describe this stage as strategic evaporation. It is not a defeat announced with banners or signatures, but a disappearance, the slow fading of control until only traces remain. Officially, Russia still claims the peninsula. Unofficially, its forces are leaving one checkpoint after another, erasing footprints as they go. To those observing the situation closely, it has become clear: the collapse of the land bridge did not just sever supply. It severed narrative. The very story of control, permanence, and strength, the one repeated for years, has unraveled in real time. And as one Western diplomat quietly put it, when a great power begins to retreat in silence, it's not the end of a war. It's the beginning of reckoning. However, beyond the official silence, there remains one unanswered question: what happens when the retreat reaches the sea, and there is nowhere left to go? By this point, the sense of finality had settled across the region like a fog. The land corridor was gone, the ferries overloaded, and the rhetoric, hollow. What remained was the slow unraveling of presence, a quiet retreat that neither side officially acknowledged but everyone understood. The collapse of Moscow's land bridge to Crimea had turned from a military event into a political reckoning, one that rippled through the system far beyond the peninsula's borders. According to intelligence briefings circulated during the day, Russian command nodes on the peninsula had reduced activity to minimum operational thresholds. In practical terms, this meant abandoning non-essential positions and preserving only exit corridors for personnel. Field headquarters in northern Crimea were dismantled, and temporary logistics depots were either emptied or destroyed. It's a systematic withdrawal disguised as tactical reorganization, one Western analyst explained. You can see it in the pattern, they're not defending, they're deleting. In expert circles, a new phrase began to surface: controlled abandonment. It described a process in which a power, unable to sustain occupation, deliberately erases traces of its presence to delay recognition of defeat. And that, according to most observers, was exactly what Russia was doing. Official maps remained unchanged, spokesmen repeated the same lines: stabilization, redeployment, temporary adjustments, but the geography itself had already spoken. The bridge was no more, and with it, the connective tissue between Crimea and Moscow had been severed, physically, logistically, symbolically. Inside the peninsula, the situation was deteriorating by the hour. Civilian communications were intermittent. Banks quietly suspended operations, cash machines went offline. Gasoline shortages forced rationing, and at several checkpoints, soldiers were reported exchanging food for transport. The once constant presence of military patrols thinned. They're disappearing in silence, a local resident told an independent monitoring group. One day there's a checkpoint, the next day, only tire marks. Satellite imagery analyzed throughout the day confirmed a steady flow of maritime traffic from Crimea toward the Russian mainland. Cargo vessels once used for grain and fuel had been repurposed to carry equipment and personnel. Some ships were overloaded, sailing without navigation lights. Maritime analysts described the scene as a shadow evacuation, unfolding without announcements, without flags. It's the last visible stage before denial, one expert commented. In Moscow, official briefings maintained the same impassive tone. The Ministry of Defense continued to refer to the situation as an operational recalibration. Yet, internal documents seen by Western agencies suggested growing concern over unsanctioned withdrawals and loss of morale among field units. The chain of command was fracturing. Field officers began issuing their own evacuation orders, bypassing central command. For a military structure built on vertical control, this was unprecedented, the erosion of obedience from within. Political analysts in the region describe the current phase as a mirror collapse. As the land bridge disintegrated physically, the credibility of Russia's leadership disintegrated symbolically. The bridge was more than a road, one political observer explained. It was a metaphor for permanence. Its destruction shattered that metaphor, and with it, the illusion of inevitability. Internationally, the tone of response was deliberate and restrained. Western capitals avoided overt celebration, focusing instead on the consequences. In Brussels and Washington, officials spoke of the new phase of deoccupation, carefully choosing words that avoided escalation. Yet, privately, the assessment was unified: this was the moment when the strategic reality caught up with the propaganda. Crimea, long presented as untouchable, was once again vulnerable. Inside Russia, that realization spread quietly. Economic indicators began to wobble. Defense-linked industries faced sudden delays as transport networks through the south were disrupted. Social media channels, despite censorship, filled with brief clips: convoys halted in fields, soldiers resting beside abandoned trucks, families packing cars with what little they could carry. Each image, small on its own, combined into a larger truth: a withdrawal no longer hidden, only unacknowledged. Meanwhile, within Crimea itself, the atmosphere grew uncanny. The sound of engines, once constant, faded. Administrative buildings stood locked, their flags lowered. Some residents described an eerie quiet at night, the kind that follows not peace, but evacuation. The city feels hollow, one observer noted. Like it's waiting to wake up from someone else's dream. According to diplomatic correspondences shared between European capitals, contingency discussions have already begun for the post-withdrawal management phase. Humanitarian agencies are preparing for potential displacement flows, while regional security analysts warn that fragments of Russian forces could remain behind in a scorched ground posture, dismantling, concealing, erasing. But even this, they say, is temporary. The retreat is irreversible, one senior official concluded. The peninsula has begun its separation not by politics, but by physics. For Moscow, the implications extend beyond geography. The land bridge was the physical proof of an empire's reach. Its collapse reveals something deeper, that the reach has limits, and those limits are now visible. The war, once defined by expansion, is shifting into contraction. And contraction, as history shows, is not a pause. It is a reckoning. By this hour, Russian broadcasts have returned to their usual rhythm: patriotic music, official speeches, empty promises. Yet, for those who have been following the signals, the silence between the words speaks louder. The land bridge is gone, but its absence has become the new connection, between illusion and reality, between power and its decay. In the end, what unfolded in Crimea was not just a retreat from territory, but from the idea of permanence itself. The withdrawal is slow, methodical, quiet, but undeniable. And as analysts across the world now agree, this is no longer just about a peninsula. It is about the collapse of an era built on control. At first glance, everything may seem calm again. Maps remain unchanged, statements remain rehearsed, and the machinery of denial still functions. But beneath the surface, the structure has cracked. The corridors that once connected empire to conquest have turned into escape routes. Those who study history know, great powers rarely fall with noise. They fade, step by step, under the weight of their own certainty. And today, as the last convoys move north and the last lights dim across the peninsula, one truth becomes inescapable: sometimes, the most decisive defeats arrive not with explosions, but with silence. Because when the bridge falls, it is not only the road that ends. It is the idea that it could ever be rebuilt.